He saved an Apache grandma, but the reward was worth every risk. Take care of her, brave cowboy.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun hung low over the New Mexico territory, 1882, pressing heat into the wood plank street of the settlement, the air dry enough to sting the back of the throat with every breath. Dust rolled from passing wagons, sticking to sweat on faces and hands, and the sound of horses shifting in their harnesses carried through the open doors of the trading post. Inside, the light dimmed to the glow of lanterns and narrow windows. Shelves stacked with flour, beans, salt, and rough-cut cloth lined the walls. The air was thick with the smells of rawhide, kerosene, and stale tobacco. Caleb Rawlins stepped in, letting the door shut behind him with a dull thump of tired hinges. He stood tall, broad through the shoulders, his faded cavalry coat hanging loose over worn work clothes. His boots were dust-caked, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low. At 35, he carried himself like a man who had lived 2 lives already. The war years had left scars, the most visible running across his cheek, but the deeper marks were harder to see. He had fought in places no one spoke about anymore, scouted land that had never been his to walk, and seen enough death to understand the cost of silence. Now he kept to the edges of town, buying supplies when he had to, avoiding talk whenever possible. He had come here for salt, coffee, and a spool of thread. Simple needs, enough to last another stretch alone at the cabin. He didn't look for trouble, but he carried the weight of knowing that it often found him. Near the counter stood an old Apache woman. Her back was bent, but her head was upright, her hair long and gray, braided neatly and tied with faded cloth. She wore a blanket with geometric patterns woven through it, wrapped around her frail body. She was smaller than most, but her eyes held steady, sharp as flint. She was in the post for the same reason Caleb was: survival. Flour, beans, salt. Nothing more. A ranch hand, drunk off whiskey before the sun was even down, had cornered her. His clothes were stained, his hat pulled crooked, and his face flushed red. He swayed on his boots, bottle in one hand, the other hand raised high. He cursed at her, words thick and broken. Caleb caught the tone more than the meaning, words about land, about her kind, about being in his way. The old woman did not flinch. She looked up at him like she had seen men like him before, too many times to be afraid anymore. But she did not move. Her grip stayed firm on the bundle of supplies she had picked from the counter. Caleb felt a familiar coil in his stomach tighten. It was the same tension he had felt before stepping into danger during the war. The moment of decision when a man had to choose whether to stay seated and quiet or to step forward. He hated that feeling. It dragged old memories up. But watching the man tower over the grandmother, hand raised, it was not a choice at all. He crossed the floor in 3 steady strides. His boots struck the boards hard enough to make the drunk turn. Caleb caught his wrist before the hand came down, twisting it back with practiced force, the bones grinding under his grip. The man swore and tried to pull free, but Caleb drove his other hand to the man's shoulder and pushed him against a barrel stacked with nails. The ranch hand buckled, his voice turning into a half-choked gasp. Caleb's jaw tightened as he held him there. A part of him, an old part from the war, wanted to press harder in the fight before it started. But this was no battlefield. Not anymore. He forced his hand to let go. The ranch hand staggered backward, muttering, spitting insults that didn't carry much weight now. His eyes flicked from Caleb's scar to his shoulders and then away. He saw what others usually did. A man who wouldn't move unless he had reason, but who wouldn't stop once he had. That was enough. The drunk stumbled out into the street, bottle still clutched in his hand. The room fell silent again, except for the sound of the lantern flame hissing in its glass. Caleb reached in his coat pocket, pulled $2 silver, and set them on the counter. His voice was low and flat, steady from years of learning how to keep it so. Her food's paid. Tully, the storekeeper, glanced at Caleb, then at the old woman. He nodded once, said nothing, and slid the coins into his till. He wrapped beans, flour, and a brick of lard in brown paper and set it gently in front of her. The grandmother took the bundle. Her hands shook slightly from age, but her eyes didn't waver as she lifted them to Caleb. She studied his face, her gaze steady, and he felt the weight of it in his chest, heavier than the scar that had marked him all these years. "You have my life," she said finally, her English accented but clear. Her voice was rough but firm, carrying authority even through her frailty. "Be gentle with my granddaughter." Caleb blinked, the words landing sharp and direct. He didn't understand them fully, didn't know what granddaughter she meant, or why she would place such trust on a stranger. But he knew the kind of promise those words carried. He gave a single, tight nod. He didn't trust himself to speak more. The old woman turned and left slowly, her bundle hugged to her chest. The bell over the door rang once, and the light outside swallowed her figure. Caleb stood for a moment longer, feeling the old coil of tension in his stomach begin to unspool. His jaw ached from how hard he had clenched it. He had acted out of instinct, not out of desire. He told himself that. But he knew he would remember her words, simple, sharp, and final, long after the dust on the street had settled. The wind carried a faint chill across the high desert plains as the days stretched into late winter. Caleb kept to his cabin after the trading post incident, tending chores that filled silence, splitting kindling, hauling water, mending tack. Yet his mind circled back to the old woman's words, spoken with that unshakable calm. "Be gentle with my granddaughter." He wondered why she had said it to him, a man she had never met, a man who hardly spoke. He told himself it was nothing more than words from an elder who had seen too much cruelty. But each night when he sat by the fire, her voice returned, and he found himself staring at the empty chair across the table longer than he cared to admit. 3 days passed before he had an answer. Late afternoon, the sound of footsteps carried across the dry ground outside his cabin. Caleb looked up from the woodpile, his hand tightening around the axe handle. Visitors rarely came. He stepped around the corner, ready for trouble, but what he saw stopped him cold. The grandmother was there, walking slow, leaning on a carved stick, the patterned blanket drawn close around her shoulders. Beside her moved a younger woman carrying a bundle of worn blankets and a dented tin pot. She was tall for her age, no more than 23 or 24, her posture proud despite the weight she carried. Her skin was sun-browned, her dark eyes sharp, and her long black hair was braided, strands tied with beads, feathers, and thin leather strips. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with fringe and shells, but it was torn at the neckline and along the seam of her thigh, the damage revealing more than she seemed to notice or care to hide. Caleb's gaze caught the curve of her chest through the split seam before he forced his eyes away, jaw tightening. The sight stirred questions that he knew any listener would ask if the story were told aloud. Why was the grandmother bringing her here? Why this man, when so many others lived near town? Why trust him with her granddaughter when he had done nothing but step in once at the trading post? Caleb himself wanted answers, but none came in words, only in the simple act of them, standing at his door. He set the axe aside and walked forward, his boots crunching the dry earth. The grandmother lifted her face toward him. She looked tired, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes still carried that same quiet command. "We come," she said softly. Her granddaughter looked at Caleb without flinching, as if measuring the man her elder had chosen. Caleb's chest tightened. He thought about refusing. He lived alone for a reason. War had left him with a short tongue, a temper he held down with silence, and a house built only for one. He didn't want to carry someone else's burdens, not again. Yet the words he had heard days before echoed back, and he knew his choice had been made the moment he had stepped between that drunken hand and the old woman. He pulled the cabin door open. "There's space inside," he said, his voice rough but steady. The granddaughter walked in first, setting the bundle near the hearth, her movements careful, not timid. Caleb caught the way she glanced around. At the small table, the single bed, the tools hung on pegs, marking every detail as if judging whether the place was safe. The grandmother followed, lowering herself into the chair near the fire with a weary sigh. Inside, the silence was heavy. Caleb felt it pressing at him, demanding words, but he had none. Instead, he moved with action. He set a hook for their pot over the hearth, filled it with water, and laid an extra cup on the table. The granddaughter's eyes followed his hands. She said nothing, but the small shift of her shoulders, the faint loosening of her jaw, told him she had seen enough men to know when one meant harm and when one did not. The fire crackled, throwing light across her torn dress. Caleb's eyes lingered once too long on the line of cleavage the tear exposed before he turned sharply to the woodpile, stacked against the wall. His throat felt dry. He reminded himself that she was here with her grandmother, not alone, and that the old woman's trust carried weight. The grandmother cleared her throat, breaking the silence. She cooks. She mends. She works, she said, nodding toward her granddaughter. Then, after a pause, she added, "And you quiet. That is good." Caleb let out a slow breath. He understood. They weren't here to ask permission. They were here because the grandmother had already decided. She had chosen his roof for her blood. The reasons might never be spoken aloud, but they were clear enough: safety, dignity, survival. That night, the three of them ate beans boiled in the pot she had carried, bread he had baked the day before, and nothing more. They sat in silence, only the crackle of the fire filling the gaps. But in the small movements, the granddaughter folding her grandmother's blanket neatly over her lap, Caleb setting his repaired tin plate in front of her without being asked, the grandmother's faint nod as her eyes closed for rest, something began to take root. Caleb sat long into the night after they slept, staring at the fire. His heart was steady but restless. He felt the weight of what had happened shift the air inside his cabin. The weight of strangers who were no longer strangers, and of a promise he had not spoken but had already made. Morning came pale and cold, the frost clinging to the pump handle outside and the ground hard under Caleb's boots. Inside the cabin, the smell of smoke and boiled beans lingered, a reminder of the night before. He stepped quietly, his movements deliberate, though the silence inside felt different now. Where once it had been empty, now it carried the faint rhythm of another's breath and the rustle of cloth as the granddaughter shifted under her blanket beside the fire. The grandmother still slept, her chest rising slow but steady. Caleb crouched near the hearth and stirred the embers until the flames licked up. He thought about what people would ask if they heard this story. Who were these women? Where had they come from? Why had they trusted a man like him? He knew he had no full answers, but pieces had begun to show. The grandmother had spoken of her people being pushed farther south by settlers and soldiers, many lost to sickness and hunger. Supplies from the trading post meant survival. But going there alone had left her open to the kind of cruelty he had interrupted. And the granddaughter, her name, he learned when the grandmother spoke it softly in her tongue, was Asha, had been left to shoulder the weight of keeping the elder alive. Caleb sensed in her no fear of labor, no complaint, only pride stiffened by hardship. When Asha woke, she moved without hesitation, gathering her grandmother's shawl, folding it neat, then stepping outside with a tin pot for water. Caleb followed, watching her work the pump with steady arms. Her dress shifted at the neckline, the rough tear still showing more skin than he was comfortable looking at. He found himself tightening his jaw and turning his face toward the line of cottonwoods beyond the cabin. But when the pump squeaked, he stepped in beside her, catching the handle when it stuck. Their hands brushed, and for a brief second, neither of them moved. Her skin was warm against the cold iron, her eyes lifting to his, testing. Caleb's chest tightened. He thought of pulling back, of retreating to the safety of silence, but instead he pressed the handle down, water spilling into the pot between them. Asha gave the smallest nod, then carried the pot inside without a word. Through the day, they fell into rhythm. Caleb chopped wood and hauled it to the pile. Asha knelt near the hearth, cutting strips of cloth from an old blanket to mend tears in her grandmother's shawl. At one point, she pulled at the seam of her own dress, frowning at the split along the chest. Caleb caught her glance, hesitant, almost embarrassed. He hesitated too, then set down his hatchet and went to a drawer where he kept spare thread and a bone needle. He placed them on the table, not speaking, just leaving them for her to see. She looked at the tools, then at him. Slowly, she brought the dress to the table and laid it flat, her fingers brushing his wrist as she slid it across. Caleb sat and began to sew, his hands large and rough, more used to reins and rifles than delicate work. The needle pricked his thumb once, but he kept going, pulling the thread tight across the torn fabric. He kept his eyes fixed on the stitch, forcing himself not to notice how near she sat, the faint heat of her body beside him, the curve of her chest where the fabric had once gaped. When he finished, he set the dress back down, the seam crude but strong. Asha ran her fingers along the stitch, testing its strength. For the first time, she met his eyes without looking away. She gave a short nod, her lips tightening into something close to approval. She didn't thank him aloud. She didn't need to. The grandmother had been watching from her chair, her eyes half-lidded but sharp. She spoke in her language, then in slow English. Hands that break can mend. Her words landed heavy in the silence. Caleb felt them strike deeper than he wanted. He had broken plenty in his life. Mending was harder. That night, supper was plain, beans and bread, but eaten without tension. Asha served her grandmother first, then sat across from Caleb. When the old woman leaned back to rest, Asha's hand lingered on her arm, protective. Caleb saw it and felt a strange pull inside his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. The shape of family around a table, not through blood, but through presence. Later, when the grandmother had drifted into sleep, Caleb rose to check the door latch. He turned and found Asha near the hearth, testing the mended seam of her dress. She caught him watching, and instead of covering, she held his gaze for a moment longer than before. There was no smile, no invitation, only the quiet recognition of two people who understood the cost of trust. Caleb gave a small nod, then turned to bank the fire. He lay down that night knowing nothing had been spoken. Yet something had shifted. The cabin was no longer his alone, and silence had taken on a different weight. The next morning broke with a thin frost that silvered the pump handle and left a crisp shine across the cabin's porch rail. Caleb stepped outside first, his breath showing in the air, the land quiet except for the creak of the mule in its pen. He had lived this same morning 100 times, fetching water, splitting wood, feeding the mule, but now there were more steps echoing behind him. Asha came carrying a tin cup, her hair falling in a loose braid over one shoulder, her deerskin dress mended where he had sewn it, but still worn thin in places. Her grandmother sat by the hearth inside, coughing faintly, her small shape wrapped in the patterned blanket. For the first time, Caleb understood what listeners might wonder. Was the old woman well enough to travel, to live in this place? Or was she nearing her end? Did Asha expect him to carry not just her safety, but her elder's life as well? He found himself asking the same questions, though he kept them locked inside. At the pump, Asha reached for the handle and pulled hard, but the iron groaned and stuck as it sometimes did. Caleb stepped forward without thinking, his hand falling over hers to push it down. The metal was freezing, but her skin beneath his palm was warm. For a long second, neither of them moved. Asha's eyes lifted to his face, dark and steady, not challenging but searching. Caleb's chest tightened. He thought about pulling back, keeping the distance safe, the silence intact, but he pressed down instead. Water rushed from his spout into the cup, cold and clear. Their hands stayed together on the handle even after the cup filled, until Asha shifted slightly and carried it back inside. Caleb stood still, watching her walk away, his heart beating harder than it should for something so small. Inside, the day moved with the rhythm of work. Caleb repaired the fence gate outside, while Asha cooked a thin stew with beans and dried venison strips. She moved quietly, but each task she did carried care, washing her grandmother's cup twice, folding the bedding with sharp corners, scraping the pot clean so nothing went to waste. Caleb noticed, and he realized listeners might ask something else now. Why did she take to his home so quickly? Was she used to keeping order, or was she proving herself useful so she wouldn't be cast out? The truth settled somewhere in between. She had lived long enough on the margins to know survival meant contributing, and pride kept her from being seen as helpless. That evening, after supper, the grandmother coughed harder. Caleb fetched water while Asha ground willow bark and steeped it, pressing the steam under her grandmother's nose. The old woman's breathing eased, and she muttered something in Apache before closing her eyes. Asha smoothed her braid back with gentle fingers, her face drawn with worry but proud enough not to show it to him. Caleb leaned on the table, feeling a heaviness in his chest. He had asked himself before why he had let them stay. Now he knew, because watching the way Asha bent over her grandmother reminded him of everything he had lost in the war. Family, purpose, the sense that his hands could do more than harm. When the fire burned low, the grandmother slept, her breathing rough but steady. Asha remained by the hearth, testing the seam Caleb had mended on her dress. The firelight made the repaired neckline dip lower as she shifted, her bronze skin catching the glow. She caught him looking, and instead of pulling the fabric higher, she held his eyes. Caleb felt his throat go dry, every muscle in his body telling him to turn away, to keep the barrier strong. Yet he didn't move. She rose and stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Standing before him, she lifted her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, right over the scar beneath his shirt. Her touch was firm, not timid, as if she was testing whether the man in front of her was more than just strength and silence. Caleb's breath came heavy. He knew she had been hurt before, by men who saw her as body before person, and he feared she might see the same in his gaze. But he kept still, waiting, letting her decide. Then she leaned in and kissed him, slow and steady. Her lips were warm, her hand never leaving his chest. Caleb closed his eyes and let the weight of the moment settle into him, not rushing, not taking. When she pulled back, she studied him with a calm that said the choice had been hers. He lowered his forehead to hers for a moment, a wordless answer, the only way he knew how to tell her he understood. When she stepped away, she settled back near the fire, adjusting her grandmother's blanket with care, as if nothing had changed. But Caleb sat at the table long after, staring at the flames, knowing everything had. The cabin was no longer silent in the way it used to be. The silence now held breath, touch, and unspoken promises. The next day broke with a clear sky and a sharp wind out of the north. Caleb rose early, the habit of years, and stepped outside with his rifle slung over his shoulder. The mule stamped at the pen, restless, and the ground cracked dry under his boots. He had meant to ride south to check the fence line and gather wood, but when he turned back to the cabin, he saw Asha stepping out, her grandmother still asleep inside. She carried a length of rope and a determined look. It struck him that he had not asked her much, where she had come from before this, what kin she might still have, or what dangers had followed them to his door. Listeners would ask the same questions. Why her? Why here? Why now? Caleb had wondered too, but every time he looked at her face, at the pride stitched into her jaw and the steady way she carried her grandmother's care, he found his mouth too tight to ask. They set out together that morning, walking the ridge where his post leaned. Asha worked beside him without waiting to be told, holding rails firm while he hammered new nails, bracing the gate while he cut a slot. Her hands were calloused, her movements practiced, not the softness of someone protected all her life. He realized then that she had seen work and hardship long before his cabin, and that whatever story she carried was written on her skin as plain as the sun-browned lines along her arms. At midday, they rested. Caleb opened his canteen, passing it to her. Asha drank, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, then passed it back without looking away. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that asked questions without words. Caleb finally broke it, his voice low. You had no one else? She shook her head once. Men gone. Some dead. Some scattered. Only her. She nodded toward the cabin in the distance, where the grandmother's figure was a small shadow against the firelight. Her voice did not waver, but the words carried the weight of loss. Caleb looked away, pressing his thumb against the canteen lid, remembering the men he had buried during the war, the homes left burning, the families scattered. He did not speak of it, but his silence held his answer. When they finished, they walked back. The grandmother sat on a blanket outside, her eyes half closed but watching them, as if she had known they would return together. Caleb noticed her cough had deepened. He fetched her tea, and Asha tucked the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The old woman caught Caleb's eye, and in that glance he felt another unspoken question listeners might share. Would the grandmother live long enough to see what was forming between them? Was her charge, be gentle with my granddaughter, meant for days or for a life? Caleb carried that thought heavy as he stacked the tools away. That evening, supper was stew made from beans and rabbit Asha had snared on her own. Caleb tasted it and found himself staring at her hands as she stirred the pot. They were strong hands, scarred in places, and yet delicate when she brushed a strand of hair from her face. He remembered the way she had touched his chest the night before, testing him. He wondered if she believed what she had found. After the meal, the grandmother fell asleep early, worn thin by the day. Asha and Caleb sat near the fire, their shoulders close but not touching. She broke the quiet first. "You have no wife?" Her words were blunt, her eyes on the flames. Caleb shifted, throat tightening. "Had one, before the war." He stopped there. He had never told anyone more, not in years. But Asha waited, and something in her stillness made him go on. "She died. Fever took her. I buried her on the ridge. Since then, just me." The words felt strange leaving his mouth, pulled from a place he had kept closed. Asha turned then, her face softened by the firelight. She did not speak, but her hand moved again to his chest, the same place as before. It was not a question this time. Caleb felt his breath catch. He thought about leaning in, about closing the space between them, but he held himself still, afraid of breaking the fragile thread of trust. She gave a faint nod, as if to say she understood the restraint, then lowered her hand and leaned back. The fire popped, and the cabin held the weight of everything unsaid. That night, as Caleb lay on his cot and listened to the even breathing of the two women across the room, he knew what others might still wonder. Was he their protector out of duty, or had something deeper already begun to claim him? The answer pressed at his chest like a hand that would not lift. He closed his eyes, the sound of Asha's quiet breath just enough to steady the old ghost that rose whenever he tried to sleep. By the time the thaw began to soften the edges of the land, the grandmother's cough had worsened. Her breaths came shorter, and though she still held her spine straight in the chair, Caleb could see the strain in her face when she tried to rise. Supplies were running low, and Asha had pressed him the night before with a simple statement: "We need cloth, and salt, and medicine for her." It was not a request, but a truth. Caleb knew the question would come from anyone hearing this story. Why had he not taken them back to town sooner? And what would the townsfolk say when he did? He had asked himself the same thing, but when the need was plain, there was no choice left. That morning, he hitched the mule and pulled the wagon from its lean-to. Asha sat beside him on the bench, her grandmother wrapped in blankets in the back, her eyes closed against the wind. The ride was quiet except for the groan of the wheels and the mule's steady hoofs. Caleb glanced at Asha once, the line of her jaw firm, her braid tugged loose by the wind. He wondered if she feared what waited in town, the stares, the words, the men like the one he had thrown out weeks before. But she sat tall, not shrinking, as if daring anyone to test her pride. When they arrived, the town looked much the same, dust blowing between buildings, men outside the saloon watching with narrowed eyes, women pulling shawls tighter as they stepped aside. Caleb drove straight to Tully's store. Inside, the air smelled of flour, kerosene, and old leather, the same as before. Tully looked up from his ledger, his pen pausing. His eyes flicked from Caleb to the women and back again. Then he set the pen down and asked, "What do you need?" "Cloth," Caleb said, his voice steady. "Salt. Whorehound if you've got it." Asha walked to the shelf without waiting to be told, lifting a roll of soft cotton and a spool of thread. She held them against her chest, her face blank, though Caleb caught the tension in her shoulders. The grandmother leaned heavy against the counter, breathing shallow. Caleb laid coins down. There was no haggling, no delay. Tully slid the goods across. But not everyone in town was content to watch in silence. From a saloon across the street, the same ranch hand stumbled out. The one Caleb had stopped at the trading post. His eyes were glassy, his step unsteady, but his mouth was full of spite. "Ain't enough you pay for their scraps, Rollins?" he slurred, voice carrying over the street. "You keeping him now? Keeping her too." His meaning was plain, his eyes on Asha, the torn seam of her dress where Caleb's rough stitching showed. The street hushed, waiting. Caleb stepped forward, his shoulders square, his voice calm but heavy. "She's under my roof. Nothing more, nothing less." The drunk shifted, his hand twitching at his belt, but then he saw Caleb's eyes, the same quiet, measured look he had seen before, the kind that promised no second chance. He muttered, spat in the dust, and staggered back toward the saloon. The tension broke, townsfolk pretending not to have heard as they went about their errands. Inside, Asha tied a strip of the red ribbon she had chosen at the counter around her shoulder seam, covering Caleb's stitching. It was a small act, but one that spoke louder than words. Caleb saw it and understood she would not be ashamed, not of herself and not of him. He knew listeners might wonder if he felt pride or shame at being marked so openly beside her. The truth was both: pride in her strength, shame in his own hesitation to claim what was already plain, that they stood together. The wagon rattled back toward the cabin with the supplies wrapped tight, the grandmother asleep under the blankets. Asha sat close, her arm brushing his as the mule pulled steady along the road. She didn't speak, but the ribbon caught the light, bright against the deerskin, a sign she had chosen to stay. Caleb felt the weight of that choice in his chest. That night, the grandmother's cough eased after Asha brewed the horehound tea. Caleb sat at the table, sharpening his knife, watching the two women by the fire. He thought again of the question others would ask. Was he their protector out of duty, or was something else binding them? When Asha glanced up and met his eyes, holding them without flinching, he realized the answer no longer needed words. The cabin was no longer a place of silence alone. It was a place claimed, piece by piece, by the act of staying. The thaw pressed harder with each day, turning the ground soft underfoot and sending meltwater down from the ridge in narrow streams. Caleb spent the morning hauling wood to higher ground, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold air. Inside the cabin, Asha boiled willow bark tea for her grandmother, the sharp smell filling the room. The old woman's cough came deeper now, pulling at her thin chest, each breath sounding like it scraped against stone. Caleb knew what any listener would ask at this point. How long could she last? And was she the reason the granddaughter had been brought to him so suddenly? The answer showed itself in the way Asha hovered at her grandmother's side, refusing to let her lift so much as a cup, her eyes dark with worry even when her face stayed firm. By afternoon, the grandmother called them both close. Her voice was weak but carried authority, the same as when she had spoken in the trading post weeks before. She asked for water, then pressed the cup aside and reached out her hands. Caleb hesitated before stepping closer. Asha knelt, taking her grandmother's left hand, and the old woman lifted her right, beckoning Caleb. He obeyed, his large palm swallowing her frail fingers. Then, with effort, she pulled their hands together over her blanket, folding them into one. Her eyes moved between them, and she whispered something in Apache, words Caleb could not follow. Asha translated softly. She says, "Two must walk where one cannot." The weight of her hand on theirs pressed into Caleb's chest. He had always told himself he lived alone because it was safer, because people left you sooner or later, but now here was this frail elder tying his future to hers and to Asha's with nothing more than a sentence. He thought about pulling back, but the grandmother's grip was surprisingly strong for her age. He stayed, silent, as Asha lowered her head and whispered back in her own tongue, words full of devotion that Caleb could not understand but felt all the same. That night, the fire burned steady while the grandmother rested deeper than before. Asha kept watch, spooning tea in her lips when she stirred, smoothing her braid, tucking the blanket tighter. Caleb sharpened his knife again at the table, but his eyes kept drifting to the women. He asked himself another question listeners might raise. Was he ready to carry the responsibility of both of them, when all he had wanted was silence and a roof to himself? He thought about it as the blade slid against the whetstone, the scrape steady. The truth came without words. He already was. Later, when the grandmother fell into sleep, her breathing uneven but calm, Asha sat back on her heels, exhausted. Caleb stood, poured her a tin cup of water, and set it in her hands. She drank slowly, then looked at him with eyes that held gratitude and something more. She said quietly, "She believes we are already one." Her tone carried no hesitation, only certainty. Caleb's chest tightened at her words. He did not answer right away, afraid of saying too little or too much. Instead, he reached across and laid his hand gently over hers, the same way the grandmother had done earlier. Asha did not pull back. She simply let it stay. The hours stretched late. Outside, the wind rattled through the pines, but inside the cabin the silence was different than it had ever been. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of people bound together, waiting. Caleb leaned back in his chair, watching Asha close her eyes beside her grandmother's cot. He thought about the question that would surely come next. Was this the moment when their bond turned to permanence, or was it still only the beginning? As he banked the fire and listened to their breathing, He knew it was both. The spring melt had grown stronger, water cutting deeper lines through the soil, and the air carried a damp smell of earth. Inside the cabin, the grandmother slept more often, her strength thinning day by day. Asha rarely left her side except to fetch water or prepare food, and Caleb began taking on more work, splitting wood and tending to the mule while keeping an ear tuned for the sound of her cough. He knew listeners might be asking now, was the grandmother fading fast? And if so, what would happen to Asha if she passed? Would Caleb send her away, or had his silence already bound him to her? The truth showed itself in the way he watched Asha, in the way his hands lingered when passing her a bowl, or how his eyes searched for her in every room. He already knew the answer. She was not leaving. One evening, after a long day repairing the pen, Caleb returned to find Asha outside by the creek. She had spread blankets on the rocks to dry and was rinsing a basin in the cold water. Her braid had come loose, strands of dark hair clinging to her damp cheek. Her dress, still mended at the seams, had slipped low at the shoulder as she leaned forward, the curve of her skin catching the last light. She glanced up when she heard his steps, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence carried the weight of questions unasked. Was she offering herself, or was she simply weary and unguarded? Would he risk breaking her trust if he moved closer? Caleb stood still, feeling the pulse in his throat, then walked down to help her lift the wet blanket. Their hands brushed as they wrung the cloth, and this time, neither pulled away. Asha's fingers lingered, steady, then slid against his, curling once before letting go. Caleb swallowed, his body taut with restraint, and together they spread the blanket across the rocks. When they stood again, she was closer than before, her eyes fixed on his chest as though measuring the beat of his heart. That night, after the grandmother had fallen into deep sleep, Asha moved to sit beside Caleb near the fire. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of stew still clinging to the pot. She placed her hand on his chest again, the same place she had touched before, and this time she pressed harder, testing his breath. Caleb covered her hand with his own, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, the words rough from disuse. Asha nodded once, her expression calm but certain. She leaned in, kissing him slow, then deeper. His arms circled her waist, pulling her closer until her body pressed to his, the fabric of her dress warm against his shirt. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the walls as their restraint gave way. They moved together toward his bed, careful not to stir the elder, their hands urgent but gentle. Caleb's touch was steady, every movement deliberate, as if proving he could be the man her grandmother believed him to be. Asha met him with equal certainty, her strength matched by tenderness. Their breaths filled the room, soft and raw, and when at last they stilled, it was with her head against his shoulder and his arm wrapped around her. The weight of old loneliness eased. Later, in the quiet after, Asha rose to tuck the blanket higher around her grandmother, brushing her gray hair back with soft fingers. The old woman stirred but did not wake, her lips curving faintly, as if she had known all along what had come to pass. Caleb watched from the bed, his chest heavy with something he hadn't allowed himself in years: peace. He realized then what listeners might wonder. Was this only desire, or had it become more? He knew the answer as he watched Asha's silhouette in the firelight, tending to the frail woman who had tied their hands together. This was not fleeting. It was a life forming, one meal, one touch, one night at a time. When Asha returned to him, she settled under his arm as though it were the most natural place in the world. Caleb pressed a kiss to her hair and whispered, "You stay." Her eyes closed, her hand resting over his heart, and she answered softly, "I stay." The fire burned low, and the cabin held the quiet of a home no longer borrowed but chosen. The thaw had turned the creek into a rushing line of water, and the earth smelled of spring, wet and alive. Inside the cabin, the grandmother grew weaker with each day, her body frail as paper, though her eyes still carried the same sharp weight when she looked at Caleb and Asha. Caleb knew any listener would ask the questions he had tried to ignore. Would the old woman live to see her granddaughter secure? Would she trust that Caleb would keep her safe once she was gone? And would Caleb himself be willing to bind his life openly to Asha rather than live in half measures? He had no choice but to face those answers now. The grandmother called them close one morning, her voice rough but steady. "Not much time," she said, each word slow. She reached for their hands and placed them together again, her thin fingers closing around theirs. "Stay," she whispered. Then she closed her eyes, not in pain but in peace, her breathing soft. Asha bent low, pressing her forehead to the elders, tears slipping down her cheek. Caleb stood still, his throat tight, the weight of responsibility sinking fully onto his shoulders. He knew in that moment that the old woman had not simply asked. She had given him her granddaughter's future, and she trusted him to honor it. A few days later, Caleb took Asha into town. He wore his pressed shirt beneath his old cavalry coat, his boots cleaned as best as the dust allowed. Asha came in the dress he had repaired, the red ribbons still tied at the shoulder seam. The townsfolk watched them, whispers low, but no one stepped in their way. At the small church, the parson opened his book and asked his plain questions. Caleb answered steady, Asha in quiet English, but also in her own tongue, refusing to leave any part of herself behind. The parson bound their hands with cord and wrote both their names in his ledger, one beside the other. Caleb set a brass ring he had filed himself on her finger, rough but true. When they returned to the cabin, the grandmother was resting in the chair by the fire, her blanket pulled high. Asha knelt beside her, showing her the ring. The old woman smiled faintly, the lines of her face softening, and she whispered something in Apache that Asha translated. She says, "Now I can sleep." That night, the elder closed her eyes with peace, and though her breaths came slow and shallow, she wore the look of a woman who had finished her work. In the days that followed, Caleb built a narrow bed for her near the window, so she would not have to bend. He and Asha worked side by side, hauling water, mending fence, planting beans in the warming earth. When the grandmother dozed in the sunlight, Caleb would see Asha glance at him, and in her eyes there was no doubt. The bond between them was not only in touches or whispered words, but in the steady rhythm of shared labor, in meals cooked together, in the act of staying. Caleb often thought of what people might still ask. Was this love or duty? Was it survival or something deeper? He knew the answer each time he looked across the table at Asha and saw her hand resting over the ring he had given her. Each time she pressed that same hand to his chest, as though reminding him she had chosen to stay. On the first warm evening of spring, they sat outside together, the door open, the fire inside crackling low. The grandmother slept in her bed, the air gentle around her. Caleb leaned back, Asha beside him, her braid brushing his arm. The land stretched quiet and wide before them, but the silence between them was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of home. Caleb turned, his voice low but steady. "This is ours now." Asha nodded, her hand finding his fingers tight. "Ours," she said. There were no more questions left, not for them and not for anyone listening. The man who had once lived alone now had a wife, a family, and a roof that would never again be empty. The old woman's wish had been kept. The story was finished, not with parting, but with permanence.